Hello everyone. Administrative policies. Contrary to their pre 1857 intentions of trying to modernize India on progressive lines, now the administration adopted blatantly reactionary policies on the pretext that Indians were not fit for self governance and needed British presence in their lives. Divide and rule. Determined to avoid a united mass action challenging their authority, the British rulers in India decided to practice a naked policy of divide and rule by putting princes against states, people, region against region, province against province, caste against caste, and Hindus against Muslims. After an immediate spell of repression against Muslims following the 1857 revolt, the authorities decided after 1870 to use the middle and upper educated classes among Muslims against the rising tide of nationalism, using conflicts over scarce resources in education, administrative jobs, and later political spoils which were inherent in the very logic of colonial underdevelopment as a tool to create a split along religious lines among educated Indians. Hostility towards educated Indians. The emerging middle class nationalist leadership was analyzing the exploitative colonial character of British rule and demanding Indian participation in administration. At a time when the nationalist movement was born, Indian National Congress was founded in 1885. The British interpreted the moves as a challenge to their authority and adopted a hostile attitude to such leadership. In fact, from then onwards, they opposed all those who stood for modern education. Attitude towards the zamindars. In their pursuit of reactionary policies and hope to expand their social base, the British looked for alliances with the most reactionary of social groups, the princes, zamindars, etc. The British intended to use them as a counterweight against nationalist minded intelligentsia. Now, the zamindars and landlords were hailed as the natural and traditional leaders of people. Lands of most of the Awadh talukdars confiscated prior to 1857 were restored to them. The interests and privileges of zamindars and landlords were protected in opposition to those of the peasants. The former in turn saw the British as guarantors of their very existence and became their firm supporters. Attitude towards social reforms. Having decided to side with the reactionary elements of Indian society, the British withdrew support to social reforms which they felt had aroused the wrath of orthodox sections against them. Also, by encouraging caste and communal consciousness, the British helped the reactionary forces. Underdeveloped social services. A disproportionately large expenditure on army and civil administration and the cost of wars left little to be spent on social services like education, health, sanitation, physical infrastructure, etc., a legacy which still haunts this country. And whatever facilities were established catered to the elite sections and urban areas. Labor legislations. As in the early stages of industrial revolution in Europe, the working conditions in factories and plantations in the 19th century India were miserable. Working hours were long for women and children as well as for men, and wages were low. In overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and poorly lighted working spaces, the safety measures were practically non existent. Ironically, the first ever demand for regulation of the condition of workers in factories in India came from the Lancashire textile capitalist lobby. Apprehending the emergence of a competitive rival in the Indian textile industry under conditions of cheap and unregulated labor, they demanded the appointment of a commission for investigation into factory conditions. The first commission was appointed in 1875, although the first Factory Act was not passed before 1881. The Indian Factory Act 1881 dealt primarily with the problem of child labor between 7 and 12 years of age. Its significant provisions were employment of children under 7 years of age prohibited, Working hours restricted to 9 hours per day for children to get 4 holidays in a month, and hazardous machinery to be properly fenced off. The Indian Factory Act 1891 increased the minimum age from 7 to 9 years and the maximum from 12 to 14 years for children, reduced maximum working hours for children to 7 hours a day, fixed maximum working hours for women at 11 hours per day with an 1.5 hour interval. Working hours for men were left unregulated and provided weekly holiday for all. But these laws did not apply to British owned tea and coffee plantations where the labor was exploited ruthlessly and treated like slaves. The government helped these planters by passing laws such as those which made it virtually impossible for a laborer to refuse to work once a contract was entered into. A breach of contract was a criminal offense, with the planter having the right to get the defaulting laborer arrested. More labor laws were passed under nationalist pressure in the 20th century, but overall working conditions remained deplorable as ever. Restrictions on freedom of the press. The nationalists had been quick to use new advancements in press technology to educate public opinion and influence government policies through criticism and censure, and later to arouse national consciousness. In 1835, Metcalfe had lifted restrictions imposed on the Indian press, but Lytton, fearing an increased influence of the nationalist press on public opinion, imposed restrictions on Indian language press through the infamous Vernacular Press Act 1878. This act had to be replaced under public protest in 1882. After that, the press enjoyed relative freedom for about 2 decades but was under repression again in the wake of Swadeshi and anti-partition movements as restrictions were imposed in 1908 and 1910. White racism. The notion of white superiority was maintained very carefully by the colonial rulers by systematically excluding the Indians from higher grades of services, both civil and military, from railway compartments, parks, hotels, clubs, etc., and by public display of racial arrogance through beatings, blows, and even murders reported as accidents. As Elgin once wrote, we could only govern by maintaining the fact that we were the dominant race. Though Indians in services should be encouraged, there is a point at which we must all reverse the control to ourselves if we are to remain at all. Revenue policies. Agriculture has always been the main occupation of the people in rural India. When the British obtained the Diwani rights of Bengal in 1765, the agrarian economy was the mainstay of other sectors of the economy as well. The policies of the British changed the agrarian structure as they introduced new systems of land tenures and policies of revenue administration. The main aim was to extract maximum income from land with little care about the interests of the cultivators. Hastings system. The rapacity and corruption of the employees of the company were partly responsible for one of the worst famines in Bengal in 1769-70. When Warren Hastings became the Governor General, he adopted the Izaradari system, also called the farming system, to bring some order to the revenue collection. The power to collect land revenue was given to contractors called farmers, chosen on the basis of the highest bids, that is, those who offered to pay the largest amount from a particular district or subdivision. The land, in other words, was farmed out to the highest bidders. The power of revenue collection was for 5 years at a time, quinquennial settlement. The collection was made annual in 1777. The system resulted in extortion and oppression in the collection of revenue, as the contractors were merely revenue farmers interested in their profit and did not care for peasants' welfare, and the large amounts promised by the contractors far exceeded the production capacity of the land. The policy was based on the assumption that the traditional zamindars were mere tax gatherers with no proprietary rights, so the zamindars were even discouraged from bidding. As a result, many hereditary zamindars were ousted. Also, corruption reduced the amount of revenue actually going to the government. The country was impoverished, and as agriculture diminished, so did many items that the British traded in: silk and cotton, for example. The surplus the British expected from the land revenue did not materialize. Permanent settlement. In 1776 itself, Philip Francis, a member of Hastings Council, recommended a permanent settlement in land revenue. In the end, Lord Cornwallis was sent as Governor General with instructions that the land revenue settlements with the zamindars be made permanent. Lord Cornwallis set up a committee consisting of himself, Sir John Shore, and James Grant to examine the issue. Cornwallis, himself a member of the landed aristocracy of Britain, favoured giving the right of ownership to the zamindars, who he hoped would improve the land as English landlords did. Also, the number of cultivators being too large, it was seen to be simpler to collect the revenue from the smaller number of zamindars. So, every piece of land in the areas where the permanent settlement was promulgated became a part of some zamindari or other. The permanent settlement or zamindari system covered around 19% of the territory under British rule. Introduced in Bengal and Bihar, it was extended to Orissa, Banaras, Varanasi, and northern Madras. Features: the zamindars were given proprietary rights over the land. In 1790, a 10-year settlement of tax to be paid was made with the zamindars, and in 1793, the settlement was made permanent. A fixed tax on the land had to be paid by the zamindar, and the revenue was to be collected by him from the cultivators who had now become tenants, the ryots. The zamindar was allowed to keep 1/10 to 1/11 of the revenue and give the rest to the company government. The zamindar, as the owner of the land, could sell, mortgage, or transfer it. His heirs could inherit the land along with rights and liabilities, but under the sunset clause introduced in 1794, if the tax due was not paid by sunset of a certain day, the zamindari would be taken over by the government and auctioned, and the rights would be transferred to the new owner. Regulations made in 1793, 1799, and 1812 empowered the zamindar to seize the tenant's property if the rent had not been paid, and for this he did not need the permission of any court of law. Shortcomings: the revenue was fixed at a very high rate, leaving many of the zamindars with very little or no margin for shortfalls in times of flood, drought, or other calamity. This resulted in takeover and sale of many zamindars in the years following the permanent settlement. Absentee landlordism grew as merchants and government officials, besides other zamindars, bought these lands. The high rates forced many zamindars to develop their estates into small lots of land called Patni Taluk and rent them out permanently to holders Patnidar on the promise that they would pay a fixed rent. Thus began the process of sub-infeudation. Under the settlement, zamindars were required to issue written agreements pattas to each cultivator specifying what tenant was to pay. However, no such agreements were made. The result was that the peasants were at the mercy of the zamindars to be exploited and harassed for more rent, driving the cultivators into the clutch of money lenders. The peasantry was reduced to serfdom. The zamindars did nothing to improve the land or agricultural system, concentrating only on the extraction of rent. From the government's point of view, there was no way of increasing the tax, so the revenue could not increase to meet the growing expenses of the company, which was trying to expand its base through wars. Ryotwari system. Thomas Munro and Captain Alexander Reed, who were sent in 1792 to administer the recently acquired Baramahal region of Madras Presidency, devised a system of collecting directly from villages, fixing the amount that each village had to pay. When Munro became the governor of Madras Presidency in 1820, he introduced the system which came to be known as the Ryotwari system. The most important reason for the adoption of this system from the company's point of view was that it brought in a larger revenue than any other system could have done, as no intermediaries were involved and whatever was extracted from the cultivator went directly to the government. Monroe reduced the tax to one-third of the gross produce and extended the riot-wary system to other areas in the presidency, excepting those already under permanent settlement. Unfortunately, this one-third of gross produce was nearly equal to the economic rental, and the state wanted its money regardless of the actual yield of the holding and the prices prevailing in the market. This continued for nearly 30 years, with the peasants getting deeply mired in poverty. As the system was extended to many districts that had not been surveyed, there was no clear picture of how much land a peasant cultivated or how much it would produce. The tax was fixed arbitrarily, often on the basis of what the riot has paid in early years. This was known as a put-cut assessment. The tax was so high that very often it was beyond the riot's capacity to pay, but the riots were coerced and even tortured to extract revenue. Many riots were forced into the clutch of moneylenders. In 1855, the Madras Torture Commission report revealed the practices of coercion, bribery, and corruption by the subordinate officials of the collectorate. It was from 1855 that a scientific survey of land and a fresh assessment of revenue were undertaken, resulting in a decline in the actual burden of tax. Now it was decided that the revenue rate would be half of the net value of the produce of the land, and the settlement would be made for 30 years. The reformed system of settlement was introduced in 1864, which led to agricultural prosperity and extension of agriculture in coming years, although interrupted by two famines in 1865-66 and 1876-78. In the Bombay Presidency beginning in Gujarat, the British began collecting directly from the peasants in 1813-14. After 1818, when the British conquered the Peshawar territory, the right-wary system on the Madras pattern was also introduced there under the supervision of Elphinstone, a disciple of Monroe and Governor of Bombay from 1819 to 1827, on the basis of a survey carried out in 1824-28. The state demand was fixed at 55% of the net produce. However, most of the surveys were faulty and the estimates of produce erroneous, leading to overassessment. The harassment of the peasantry reached such levels that the cultivators deserted their fields and large tracts of land remained fallow. Around 1836, Wingate and Goldsmith improved the system. This modified assessment covered most of the Deccan. By 1865, each field was to be assessed on the basis of its soil and location. The land revenue was somewhat reduced, and the land that had become devalued acquired some saleable value. The system was extended to Berar, East Bengal, and parts of Assam and Pur. It may be noted that the system was devised at a time when utilitarian ideas had begun to influence policy planning in India, among which was David Ricardo's theory of rent. Features: ownership and occupancy rights of land were vested in the riot, and there was no limit on the extent of land they could own. They were free to sublet, transfer, or sell their lands. Riots paid the tax directly to the company. The revenue to be paid was in the range of 45% to 55% based on an estimated production of the land. Revenue was not fixed, so it could be raised when production was higher. The settlement was not permanent and could be revised periodically. In theory, the riot were allowed to cultivate the land of their choice, but in practice they were more or less forced to cultivate land even if they did not want to do so. Barren land under government control was allowed to be cultivated, and the revenue generated would have to be shared with the government. Land could be confiscated if the revenue was not paid. Shortcomings: overassessment of revenue was a major problem. The land revenue fixed was more than the capacity of the land. The method of collection was inflexible, often involving torture to extract tax. Corruption grew as the officers could be bribed while assessing the land. It was possible for non-cultivating landlords to get registered as the owners of particular holdings, with the actual cultivator being reduced to becoming their tenants, servants, or even bonded laborers. The high tax and the high harassment in collection devalued land value as not many wanted to buy it. Mahalwari system. The adoption of Mahalwari system in parts of northern India began to be considered in 1819 when Holt Mackenzie, the secretary to the Board of Commissioners, recommended this form of settlement of land revenue. The recommendation was formalized by the Regulation 7 of 1922. The complex method of survey, high revenue demand, and harsh methods of extraction led to a breakdown of the scheme. The situation was worsened by the agricultural depression of 1828. Even as arrears began to accumulate, the land remained uncultivated and there were few buyers of land. It was in 1833 when William Bentinck was Governor General that the regulation of 1833 simplified the procedure for estimating the produce. Martins Bird, regarded as the father of land settlements in northern India, supervised the new scheme. It consisted of a survey of a tract of land showing field boundaries of cultivated and fallow lands. The state share was fixed at 66% of the rental value and the settlement was made for 30 years. Even this rate was too high, so Lord Dalhousie issued fresh directions to the settlement officers in 1855, under which the state demand was limited up to 50% of the rental value. This system came to be known as a modified zamindari system because the village headman was a link between the individual cultivator and the government. However, he did not have the rights that the zamindar had. It is to be noted that the settlement had different versions and operated with different names at different places. In the northwestern provinces, it went under the name of Mauzawar. In the region of the central provinces, its name was Malguzari. The system was a dual system in which settlement was done collectively with the whole community and also with individual landlords. Features: Mahal, a Hindi word denoting a house or by extension an estate, was the basis of revenue assessment in this system. In the Mahalwari system, a Mahal could be a village or a group of villages and was considered as the unit for assessment of tax. Revenue was determined on the basis of the produce of a Mahal. The village community was considered the owner of the land. Individual ownership rights lay with the cultivator. Each individual farmer gave his share of the tax. The responsibility of collection of the tax and payment of that tax to the company government lay with the village headman called Lambardar or a community of village leaders. Under Bentinck, the state's revenue share was 66% of the rental value. Later, this was modified to 50%. The concept of average rents for different soils classes was introduced. In the Malwari regions, the land revenue was revised periodically. Shortcomings: the system required the government officials to record all the rights of cultivators, zamindars, and others and fix the tax payable on every piece of land. This was practically impossible to implement. The calculations the officials made were often quite inaccurate, often being based on guesswork, and the collectors usually manipulated them to increase the revenue due to the government. There was scope for corruptions too. It hardly favored the village communities. It in fact ruined them by imposing exorbitant tax assessments that could not be complied with. In the face of inability of cultivators and landholders to meet the rates of taxation, large tracts of land went to money lenders and merchants who ousted the old cultivating proprietors or turned them into tenants. On the whole, the settlement system led to the impoverishment and large-scale dispossession of the cultivating communities in North India, and their resentment and discontent found expression in the popular uprisings in 1857. From the company point of view, more was spent for the collection than the revenue collected. Overall impact of the British land revenue settlement systems. Overall impact of the British land revenue systems. The Malwari settlement was introduced in about 30% of the total area under British rule, that is, in major parts of the northwestern provinces, central provinces, and the Punjab with some variations. The Rightwari system covered about 51% of the area under British rule, comprising part of the Bombay and Madras presidencies, Assam, and certain other parts of British India. All these revenue settlements proved disastrous for farmers and zamindars too. As the revenue fixed by the system was too high, many zamindars defaulted on payments and their property was seized. High rates of land revenue indebted the farmers for lifelong. Various types of revenue settlement gave rise to a new form of private ownership of land in which the benefit of the innovation did not reach the cultivators. Instead, it led to the impoverishment of the peasantry and hence rural indebtedness. With zamindar's permanent right on land, the ownership of land became unequal. Land became saleable, mortgageable, and alienable to protect the government's revenue. The village community was divided into two hostile groups, land owning class and landless peasantry. The stability and continuity of the Indian village was shaken. The village artisans became jobless and were converted into landless laborers. Under these systems, law courts, lawyer fees, and formal procedures replaced the old body of customs. The British land revenue systems exposed the Indian peasantry to the exploitations of the moneylenders and the middlemen. The government demand of revenues was arbitrarily high. In such a situation, the landlords delegated the collection of revenue to middlemen who squeezed high sums from the peasants. The new systems gave rise to absentee landlordism as the practice of subletting revenue collection rights came into being. Exorbitant revenue demands led to commercialization of agriculture. Like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you. Bye.